Beijing now with the latest on the crackdown. Bernie?
Ralph, it is 4 o'clock in the morning here. Beijing has not gone to bed. China's sons and daughters are in the streets of Beijing at this hour, and some of those sons are soldiers who've been ordered in to put down what is happening right now in Tiananmen Square. But those soldiers, as you indicate, cannot get to where we are watching now because the people have clogged the streets. Over the past few hours, developments have been breaking very fast if you've been watching CNN for the past 6 hours. First, there were reports that the Standing Committee of the ruling Politburo had accepted the resignation of Party Chief Zhao Ziyang because Zhao refused to order a crackdown. And then student leaders announced that they had called off their hunger strike. Then a government warning broadcast by loudspeaker to these students. That warning that the protest was being declared illegal.
The government of the People's Republic of China is asking for your cooperation. We must unite our energy together to maintain law and order in Tiananmen Square. At this time, the government is asking for all middle school students to leave the square. There is no danger. To ensure your safety, please leave Tiananmen Square immediately.
Next, Premier Li Peng speaking over national television a few minutes after the midnight deadline to clear the square, ordering a stop to the protest had passed. Party Chief Zhao was not present, and Li appeared to signal Zhao's demise by announcing that Li, was speaking for the Communist Party of China. Li said that the government had been, quote, reasonable for more than a month. But he claimed that some people were using the hunger strikers as hostages to overthrow the government. And he told party and military leaders that the army had to be called in to restore order.
We can hardly predict what will happen. Maybe the result will be very serious if we don't take really measures to crack down this. The situation in Beijing is getting worse. And it is going to bring out a nationwide riot. If we don't really do anything to stop this situation, the nationwide riot will break out. And the open policy of China and the modernization of China will not be achieved. And the future of the People's Republic of China will be strongly threatened. Those people who take the advantage of students' demonstration in order to reach their own purpose have thought wrong. They have a wrong idea. They think that they expect that the government will be weak towards the students' demonstration, but we are not. The Communist Party is a strong party, and the government is a responsible party. The government is a responsible government. So we are going to have a very tough measure.
Now, the army that was called in apparently is the 27th Army based north of Beijing, and that location is very important because the 38th Army, which would normally guard this capital, is sympathetic to the students and does not want to use force against them. The 38th is based in South Beijing. But at staging points a few miles away from the square, crowds surrounded the trucks, pleaded with the soldiers to join the cause and not use violence. This is the scene around Beijing, 5-6 miles away from these pictures where it was taken. This area was taken in western Beijing. One could hear people in the streets just outside our hotel just a short while ago shouting, demonstrating, and the troops cannot move. The people in the streets appealing to soldiers of the Chinese army, don't do this. Don't go down to Tiananmen Square. Join us. Be with the people. One woman was seen letting air out of the tires of one of the trucks in one of the convoys. As we say, Beijing is a city that has not gone to bed. None of us have gone to bed, for that matter. Let's go live now to one of our correspondents at Tiananmen Square, our Moscow Bureau Chief, Steve Hurst. Steve?
Bernie, we've got an incredibly noisy scene down here right now as we're creeping slowly towards dawn. For about the 8th time since it was broadcast live over loudspeakers, the speech by Premier Li Peng is being rebroadcast again. We just went through a series of applause there. Here he is speaking again. The crudest sort of propaganda going on here now. Periodically, the students whose mood seems to be buoyed as dawn is approaching stand and applaud. Big trucks go by here. There are none in view now, with dozens of workers apparently on the back of these flatbed trucks, waving banners, heading west out of town to the place where the troops are. The expectation, the fears that the troops would come in and sweep the protesters away, the hunger strikers away, is diminishing as the hours pass now. And it wasn't terribly long ago that a hunger strike, the resumption of the hunger strike, was re-announced by the famed poet Chen Yuanming.
About 200,000 students have announced to go on hunger strike for democracy of our motherland. Now, I, Chen Mingyuan, announced to go on hunger strike for protest. I decided to support my dear students because they are right and our government is wrong.
The scene, as I said, is a noisy one. We keep having vehicles going by, ambulances race by screaming. Apparently, they have been commandeered by the protesters for no other reason than to run up and down the street here, blowing their sirens, keeping the crowd alive. And they're very, very much alive right now. Bernie?
Thank you. Steve Hurst reporting live. We're going to pause, and when we return, more of our live coverage of Beijing. Early, shortly past 4 o'clock in the morning, Saturday morning our time. We will be right back.
Live reports from China today, 5 Eastern on CNN.
Bernard Shaw back here in Beijing. We're at this moment. The students and their thousands, perhaps 100,000 plus right now, have challenged the Communist Party's government here, in effect saying, if you want us, come and get us. The situation is at a standoff. Mike Chenoy, you're down there at Tiananmen Square.
Yes, that's right, Bernie. A number of factors seem to have contributed to the government's decision to stage a crackdown, or at least make all the preparations for a crackdown. One was that the protests not only were growing here in Beijing, but they were spreading throughout the country. In Shanghai, earlier in the day, over 100,000 people brought the center of China's largest city to a virtual halt. And there have been frequent reports of demonstrations in other Chinese cities. At the same time, there were reports that workers here in Beijing had issued a call for a 24-hour general strike beginning about 8 hours from now. On top of this, the students here had rebuffed all of the efforts which the government had made at conciliation, although it's widely viewed by many of us who've been following the situation that the efforts the government did make were too little and too late, that the students' basic demands were not addressed, and that the hunger strikers were not prepared to accept cosmetic gestures. The result was a situation of potential confrontation, which thousands of people remain here waiting for the military to move in. Bernie?
Mike Chenoy, with Steve Hurst there by you, let's take a moment to step back and analyze what's going on here as we watch unfolding events. It seems to me that these Chinese leaders the head of government. It seems to me these Chinese leaders are trapped by their own culture, the Chinese culture, which so strongly cherishes family ties. Premier Li Peng stressed again and again in that address that we carried fully on CNN earlier that the soldiers are not here to fight the students. It seemed that he was trying to make it emphatically clear that the students they care about, they love. And then these leaders cannot move against these students now because they are supported by thousands and thousands of other people.
Well, I think that the leadership is caught in a very, very difficult situation. These students are the best and brightest in China. They are the people going to the Chinese versions of Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Columbia. They are the next generation of leaders, and they are rejecting the system they are being trained to inherit. It puts the government in a very difficult situation. In fact, one of the things that we heard earlier was that one of the factors influencing the decision of the 38th Army to refuse orders to intervene is that the daughter of the commander of that army is said to be among the hunger strikers, although we cannot absolutely confirm that. But in the final analysis, these men are hard-bitten politicians and revolutionaries for many, many years, and when push comes to shove, if they feel their hold on political power is threatened, they are going to act. Steve?
Bernie, I would also say that coming with a Moscow vantage point on this, rulers of communist countries do, in fact, remember revolutions. They've studied revolutions. They know how they happen. And I think the men in the Great Hall of the People looked around and saw a revolution on their hands, and they decided they either had to crack down or surrender power. It was just that kind of thing. And picking up on what Mike said, right before us now are dozens of students from the medical school here in Beijing. It's kind of like the University of Chicago Medical School emptying into the streets to protest what is going on in the United States. It's quite an incredible scene. So I think the men knew that they had to act now. The thing is that they have been frustrated in their bold action against the students by the rest of the population of Beijing rushing to the outskirts of the city to stand in front of their trucks saying, if you're going to move into the city, you're going to move into the city over us. Do you want to do that? Bernie?
And Steve and Mike, to button up what we're talking about, it's really ironic because Zhao Ziyang, who resigned as party leader, apparently was a man who was pushing for faster reform, because both Steve, Mike Chinoy, G.D. Most, we've all been stressing what people around the world, many China observers have noted. You cannot have economic reform without political reform. And I want to conclude by just quoting this passage. These are the words of Zhao Ziyang, as quoted by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his latest book, The Grand Failure, The Birth and Death of Communism in the 20th Century. These are the words of Zhao Ziyang, quote, "The deepening of the ongoing reform of the economic structure makes reform of the political structure increasingly urgent," unquote. Zhao Ziyang, a man who has stepped down. Ralph Wingy joins us from Atlanta. Ralph?
Bernie, thank you very much. Of course, there are numerous other developments taking place today around the world, and we'll be bringing those stories to you when the International Hour. Now to CNN's Steve Hurst. Steve.
Lou, you're exactly right. The students haven't budged at all, and the square is filling up this morning much more quickly than it ever has before. It looks to be a day of the biggest protest yet. Yesterday, we heard about the announcement of a independent workers' union being formed in the city. That group had said that it was going to go on strike at noon today if the government didn't meet its demands. Obviously, the government didn't meet its demands. It instead ordered troops to the outskirts of the city, where they're now bogged down, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of protesters, students, workers. At any rate, the strike looks to be on at 6 a.m. today, the start of the work shift here. The workers aren't waiting now that the troops are deployed. The dramatic protest seemed to be losing steam in its 7th day. The mood had grown less hopeful. The hunger strikers were in bad shape. Everyone was brutally tired. The students, at one point toward late afternoon, ordered the hunger strikers out of the buses where they were taking shelter. The students apparently were trying to regroup, to regain the initiative. Then the students called off the hunger strike, but vowed to maintain the sit-in occupation of Tiananmen Square. Also, as they were taking that action, rumors began to spread that Communist Party leader Zhao Ziyang had offered to resign. Then came word that troops were massing on the outskirts of Beijing. The mood grew sullen. Protesters began to mass around the perimeter of the square. The government then went on public address systems to say continued demonstrations were illegal.
At this time, the government is asking for all middle school students to leave the square. There is no danger. To ensure your safety, please leave Tiananmen Square immediately.
The crowd grew even larger, and then Premier Li Peng began to speak, justifying in the harshest terms the sending in of troops.
We can hardly predict what will happen. Maybe the result will be very serious if we don't take really measures to crack down this. The situation in Beijing is getting worse. And it is going to bring out a nationwide riot.
The students jeered as his speech was broadcast on speakers near the square. And not long after, masses of demonstrators marched out of Beijing and rode in cars to the west. Before dawn, more than 100,000 were on the outskirts of the city, taunting the troops, sitting in front of their trucks, making movement impossible. Taking the confrontation to the troops, not waiting for the army to reach town. As the night wore on, famed poet Chen Yuanming announced the resumption of the hunger strike.
I, Chen Mingyuan, announced to go on hunger strike for protest. I decided to support my dear students because they are right and our government is wrong.
And about that time, the mood of the protesters began to pick up. Fear turned once again to defiance. The students and other protesters had, for the moment, held their ground against the government counterattack. You can hear clapping in the background, applause. That's for the honor guard that just marched away after raising the flag. The students sang the Chinese national anthem. The big question now in this standoff, however, is how the troops are thinking. One wonders if they would indeed follow orders to move on the demonstrators if they knew they were going to be driving over peaceful demonstrators. So far, that answer has been no, but we'll have to see what the tensions of daylight bring. What will the Army commanders do? There's also been a dramatic political story going on behind closed doors in the Great Hall of the People. There's a major shakeup apparently at the top of the Communist Party. And for more on that, we go to Beijing, CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief, Mike Shinoy.
It was a day that began with a gesture of reconciliation. Communist Party Chief Zhao and Premier Li visiting Tiananmen Square to appeal for an end to the student hunger strike. It ended in confrontation, with the Premier announcing that the army had been called in to suppress the demonstrations, and Communist Party Chief Zhao reportedly in political disgrace. In between, huge crowds again surged through the center of Beijing. People from all walks of life, workers, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, even some peasants from the countryside, all lending their support to the hunger strikers' demand for freedom and democracy. At the same time, over 100,000 people demonstrated in Shanghai, where 300 students had begun their own hunger strike. The center of China's largest city was paralyzed, overshadowing a port call by the U.S. 7th Fleet. As the protest continued, the Communist Party leadership held an emergency meeting and decided finally to crack down. Late in the evening, Premier Li appeared on nationwide television to announce that the situation was out of control and that the army was being called in to restore order.
The situation in Beijing is getting worse. And it is going to bring out a nationwide riot if we don't really do anything to stop this situation.
As he spoke, there were growing indications that Communist Party Chief Zhao, a liberal who had sympathized with the students, was in big political trouble, with reports that he had been forced to resign. If true, his departure would be a major blow for China's reformers and for its long-term political stability. Not only was Zhao the chief proponent of change, he was also Deng Xiaoping's personal choice to guide China's ruling Communist Party as power passes to a new, younger generation of leaders. His absence will leave the country in the hands of cautious conservatives, men like Li Peng, who favor a slower pace of change. Ironically, this is the second time student-inspired protests have destroyed Deng Xiaoping's plans for an orderly succession. In January 1987, Zhao's predecessor, Hu Yaobang, was also sacked for a similar reason, taking too liberal a line towards anti-government protests. It is ironic that it was Hu Yaobang's death a month ago that triggered the current round of demonstrations. This time, however, the scale of the protest is much greater, as is the determination of those involved to carry on the struggle for democratic reforms, whatever the government may do. Mike Chenoy, CNN, Beijing.
The sun is rising on the 8th day of this massive protest, probably the biggest political turmoil in China in the 40 years since the Communist Revolution. Behind me, you can see the protest banners still flapping. The square continues to fill up much more rapidly than it has any other morning. It looks to be the biggest day of the protest yet. And as we've heard here in Tiananmen Square, there are a lot of workers who haven't gone to work. They're going to be coming to the square or going to the outskirts to stand in front of the trucks carrying the soldiers that are mired down in the protests there, unable to get into the center of the city to carry out the task that was set for them by Premier Li Peng last night in his speech. Lou?
Steve, because this protest is so broad-based now, is it likely that this confrontation in Tiananmen Square between the protesters and the government can be resolved before the political struggle can be resolved?
That's a very, very good question. We don't know what's going on in this political struggle. However, we do believe from indications last night that the Communist Party chief, Zhao Ziyang, has been either ousted or stepped down because of his frustrations in being unable to get the rest of the leadership to go along with him on a lenient line. I think that with the political leadership in turmoil, with troops on the edge of the city, with the square full of the biggest crowd yet, that's what we're expecting, this is going to be a crucial day, if not the crucial day. I think that the troops are having trouble getting organized. I don't think that there is much support for the government in the troops, and it's going to be interesting to see if the leadership in the army tells the troops to move, to drive across those protesters who've laid down a human barricade. What will happen? That seems, to my mind this morning, to be the key to what will happen the rest of this day.
The government has taken a very bold step in moving those troops into and around Tiananmen Square. If, in fact, they do not use force, would it not be interpreted as a major defeat for the government?
Well, I think the question now is, can they use force? The troops were brought up. The rumors of the troops being brought up was known early on here. And as soon as the premier made his speech, there was jeering in the square here, catcalling, and immediately we saw caravans of trucks, cars, taxis, bicycles, motorcycles, people marching towards the outskirts of the city, and they have effectively stopped the Chinese army from entering the Chinese capital.
Do the students have a plan? Should there be some kind of confrontation with the troops? Is there any kind of organized effort to resist or not resist?
Well, when this first became known last night, the students who have occupied the square now in its the demonstration now in its 8th day, the student leaders told the elementary school and high school students, please get out of the square. And they also told the people who remained behind not to hit back if they were hit, just to go limp. However, I don't know how that's going to be changing now, because the initial fear that these people had when they thought the troops were going to be marching across the square within a matter of hours, it has turned into some sort of joy here this morning. They feel they have won. There is a great deal of applause as workers who are not working go by in their trucks. There is just an incredible mass of people here for this time in the morning. This is the biggest crowd that has been on the square at dawn in any day of this protest so far.
All right, Steve Hurst in Tiananmen Square as day breaks over Beijing, China, and CNN continues to cover this dramatic story. Ahead on New...
Government control have begun heading out of the city, turned back by a more powerful force. the will of the people. This is the first time that we have seen choppers, and they are over Tiananmen Square as we report to you from Beijing.
Here they come again, Bernie. There's helicopters circling the square. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them.
Hold on just a second. Okay. The Reuters bulletin out of Beijing is that martial law has been imposed on certain areas of Beijing. This is sketchy. This is very sketchy, and we'll try to clean that up for you. But the bulletin that's being passed on to me by Larry Register, our producer upstairs, is that Reuters is moving a lead that says martial law has been imposed on portions of Beijing. Unbelievable. We all came here to cover a summit, and we walked into a revolution. We came here to cover a summit in Beijing, and now, as we report to our viewers around the world, martial law has been declared in Beijing. Our people are sending word to us from the field that the government is announcing that the city of Beijing is closed and, quote, foreign journalists can no longer report any... Let me begin once more. Quote, foreign journalists can no longer report any news, any information from this capital.
I think that is a clear sign that we are going to have some bloodshed here. And I think it is a clear sign, contrary to what you said a little while ago, Bernie, that all of us who have been involved in reporting the news are now in some risk.
I'm being told that the government officials are coming into the CNN control room now. This man with a piece of paper in his hand, I'm certain that is not a party invitation. And let's just watch what happens. It seems to me this official has come in, officially told CNN, and he has a piece of paper. Alec Miron is appealing to this official, and this official is calling his bosses.
Our agreement was to transmit until 6 o'clock tonight. That was our agreement. We had a 5:59 Beijing time p.m. That was our agreement. We don't know anything about a new agreement.
This official now is writing out what he has been told to say on this legal pad. CNN had asked for official word in writing. CNN had asked for official word in writing because legal agreements had been entered into by this network with the government of the People's Republic of China. And these characters being written on this legal pad, in effect, are saying that this government is telling CNN to end its transmission. This scene unfolding in the CNN control room at the Great Wall Sheraton Hotel in Beijing as the thousands, more than 100,000 people surround and stand in Tiananmen Square, which has been the focal point of this story out of Beijing during and obviously after the Sino-Soviet summit attended by the ranking Chinese government leaders and the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev.
Alice, can you just please read it to me? Somebody read it to me?
We have this gentleman over here.
As an observer of the Ministry of Telecommunications of China, and according to the directive from the superiors, Mr. Gorbachev's China visit is over. Now I'm here announcing that CNN should stop the movable Earth station and its transmitting frequencies right away. Mr. Cho Yan-jun, 11:02, 20th of May, 1989, Beijing summertime.
Jane? Okay, the government's order, our policy is the government has ordered us to shut down our facility. We are shutting down our facility.
Can we sign off? May we sign off?
Yeah, let's see Bernie.
May we sign off?
Let's see Bernie.
May we sign off?
Okay, we've heard the orders. We have our instructions from headquarters in Atlanta for Steve Hurst.
Goodbye. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very interesting. I've never seen anything like this.
John Lewis.
Interesting hardly describes what we've seen, Bernie.
Mike Chinoy.
The most extraordinary event I've ever witnessed in 20 years of following China.
In my 26 years in this business, I've never seen anything like this. The situation in Tiananmen Square is that it is a standoff. The people are there, the troops are not there. They were ordered in. They came as far as they could get, 5 miles outside. They were talked to by the people, persuaded to leave. They turned around, promising never to come back. Earlier, there were 4 or 5 choppers buzzing this area, and we're told that they were Air Force pilots who earlier had been seen giving flowers and money to these people, these students who began their hunger strike, and a strike which acquired the interest and the support of hundreds of thousands of Chinese. Everything is peaceful in this nation, even though the government here has declared martial law. That's the story to the moment. For all of the hard-working men and women of CNN, goodbye from Beijing.
Martial law at this hour as hundreds of thousands of students and supporters continue their protesting in the streets. CNN's Mike Chinoy reports that troops have been called in to quell the demonstrations and in some areas that led to violence.
With helicopters swooping over downtown Beijing, hundreds of thousands of people remained in Tiananmen Square hours after martial law was declared, and more were pouring in from all over the city. It was an extraordinary act of defiance, matched only by the huge crowds elsewhere which gathered to block the roads leading into the city center, preventing tens of thousands of soldiers from reaching the square and breaking up the protest. Workers in large numbers joined the students in stopping the troops. "Don't do this," they cried. "Don't do this." In many areas, the soldiers backed down, halting their advance, in some cases retreating. But there were reports of some clashes, with troops beating students near the square and peasants fighting hand-to-hand with soldiers just outside the city. As the people responded to the government's crackdown by putting their bodies on the line, Chinese television repeatedly broadcast Premier Li Peng's strongly worded speech, as well as details of the new martial law regulations. These put most of Beijing under military rule and imposed severe restrictions on news reporting. But in the square, the mood remained defiant, the protesters preparing makeshift gas masks, while helicopters dropped leaflets warning that force would be used to clear the square if the demonstrators did not leave. So far, the final protest has not yet materialized, but most of those at Tiananmen were convinced it was only a matter of time before blood flows in the streets of Beijing. Mike Chinoy, CNN, Beijing.
There is speculation that Communist Party General Secretary Zhao Zhang has been forced to resign due to the protesting. He's a respected reformist, and he had pushed for compromise with the students.
For several hours this morning, Beijing time, China was under a news blackout. Chinese officials forced CNN to stop transmitting from Beijing. What follows are the final 2.5 minutes of our coverage from the...
Even though the government here has declared martial law. That's the story to the moment. For all of the hard-working men and women of CNN, goodbye from Beijing.
President Bush says he is concerned about the possibility of violence in
Beijing. Chinese and Chinese-American students called for changes in leadership back home, a change toward democracy.
They are not different from feudal leaders or totalitarian rulers because they couldn't accept the fact that people are the masters, not themselves. Every Chinese scholar student in the United States supports them. That's second, we put great pressure on the government. We tell them that Li Peng is wrong, that the several top guys are wrong, and the people are right.
We should have people come and to support our students and support democracy.
That demonstration in Washington was not the only one in support of the Chinese students. Rallies were also held in other cities, Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta, and overseas in Hong Kong and Macau. Here now to help put in perspective some of the dramatic events in China is Harry Harding.
Funniest ladies. Gilda Radner is dead at the age of 42. Hello, I'm Dave Walker at CNN Center in Atlanta. We'll look now at our top story. The standoff in China continues. The people of Beijing are still holding the heart of the city in open defiance of the government's martial law decree. Thousands of people are manning makeshift barricades to keep government troops away from Tiananmen Square. There are unconfirmed reports those troops have sealed off Beijing and have occupied the central train station. The Chinese government has banned all satellite transmissions out of Beijing, which limits our coverage of what's going on. But joining us now by telephone from Beijing is CNN's Steve Hurst. Steve, can you bring us up to date on what's going on there now?
Yes, I can indeed. The square, while still filled with these people pulling off this popular revolt, is extremely quiet. The most impressive thing there now is the peace and quiet, the smell of disinfectant. There are no toilet facilities or water there, and the people are spreading around disinfectant. We can see smoke billowing up from the area now, and it's the protesters gathering and burning the garbage, trying to keep the place somewhat clean, although it's a real mess there now. The people have been there for 8 days. This is their 9th day continuing this protest. This morning, just after dawn, as has happened the last 2 days, Army helicopters, 5 of them today, buzzed over the square, causing a great deal of excitement. The people are fearing that the government is going to try to disperse them from the square using tear gas. That has not happened yet, and it doesn't seem to be going to happen, at least in the daylight hours or shortly after dawn. The people have kept the troops out of the square since they were ordered into the city overnight Friday night, by barricading the major thoroughfares with city buses. They're stopping virtually all traffic into the center of the city with these barricades and checking the cars, bicycles, people on foot, pedestrians, to make sure that Army infiltrators are not making their way in plain clothes into the area. But so far, the standoff continues. The people pulling off a revolt of incredible proportions. No one thought this could happen as little as a week ago, and here we have the government stymied, unable to get Chinese troops into the center of the Chinese capital.
Steve, we have been getting wire service reports indicating that the Chinese army has now effectively sealed off Beijing, and that they have now occupied the train station, the central train station. Can you confirm that?
Well, I am not surprised that Beijing is well sealed off by the troops who have been brought in from all over China. However, we checked the train station as little as about an hour ago, and there were no signs of troops. However, there is an intricate system of underground tunnels and passageways under Beijing that were built many years ago when the Chinese had this great fear that the Soviets might invade. This underground system was built as an escape route out of Beijing and a means of getting around the city underground. So there could be a lot of troops in those underground passageways. The question remains, though, even if the troops do get near to the protest, will they, in fact, move against these students? Because, as I have been trying to emphasize, this indeed is a popular revolt. And the troops, I think, are going to be hard-pressed to, in their conscience, move against their own people.
Steve, thank you very much. Steve Hurst reporting from Beijing. The tense standoff in China echoed around the world on Saturday. In Hong Kong, hundreds of nervous residents braved a typhoon to protest in front of the new China news agency, China's de facto embassy in Hong Kong. Hong Kong shares a border with China, and people there are nervously following what they see as a crackdown by Chinese hardliners. Chinese students studying in the United States also took to the streets on Saturday. In Washington, 4,000 strong demonstrated their support of the pro-democracy movement in China, and they strongly protested the Chinese government's martial law clampdown and the use of military force to quell unrest. Chinese students protesting in Boston say they are confused by the silence of the U.S. government. They say they would like a stronger U.S. line on events in China. Rallies were held in Atlanta and other cities around the country on Saturday. Chinese Americans gathered to show their solidarity with pro-democracy forces in China. They also collected money to send to the protesters in China. As the unprecedented turn of events unfold in China, President Bush appears to be taking a watch-and-wait approach. CNN White House.
As China's showdown with itself persists, restraint is also guiding Washington's response. After the meetings in Maine, Secretary of State James Baker was asked if the U.S. should be encouraging the student protesters.
I think we should be expressing our support for freedom of speech.
for democratization and for freedom of assembly, and that's what we're doing. I do not think that we should in any way be seen to be somehow inciting to riot.
The administration is trying to walk a fine line here and is carefully measuring the signals it sends to the protesters and to the Chinese leadership. But some complain the message is too weak. A group of Chinese students from Boston delivered a letter urging the president to do more.
I would like the president to issue immediately a very strong warning against the Chinese, a condemnation of the use of violence, and also the warning of using severe sanctions against the Chinese government should it employ massive military force against peaceful demonstrators.
Presidential spokesman Marlon Fitzwater received the letter and said he would deliver it. President Bush met with Premier Li Peng when he visited China in February. The Secretary of State says it's premature to conclude how the leadership may be changing.
It's a little bit unclear exactly what the situation is, as between the hardliners on the one hand and those who profess to support more openness on the other.
But action taken by Chinese authorities to pull the plug on CNN and other Western television networks that were broadcasting live from Beijing.
Demonstrators are convinced there will be bloodshed. The protesters have started putting barricades around their positions, and in another part of the city, thousands of protesters have circled a train full of soldiers and refused to let them go. The soldiers are armed with automatic weapons, but so far, the confrontation has been peaceful. The pro-democracy protesters are getting a lot of support from their friends in the U.S. Over 3,000 people yesterday marched in front of the Chinese embassy.
Cowed by this government order to leave, that Zhao Zhang could be reinstated.
Well, one cannot rule out that possibility depending on how this situation evolves. We do not know his exact status or whereabouts at the moment. There are all kinds of rumors, and they are only rumors, that he is under some kind of house arrest. Some rumors say he's not. Some rumors say he's in a military hospital. It's all completely speculative and unconfirmed. But I think it's important to stress here that it is not merely Zhao Ziyang that appears to be involved in this whole process. Using some of the old tools of China watching, it has been noted that virtually none of the sort of most distinguished senior figures in the party or the government hierarchy have publicly, through the official government-controlled media, endorsed the martial law crackdown. Neither, it's worth noting, have the governments of most of China's provinces. And in the oblique way of Chinese politics, that's a pretty good indication of widespread opposition. So the question really now is whether this opposition is strong enough and whether it includes sufficient support within the military to countermand the martial law declaration and the decision to impose a military crackdown. It's an absolutely explosive situation and unprecedented in the history of communist China.
And you've been working there quite some years. I'm curious as to what it's like to be watching history unfold. It's almost being an eyewitness to the storming of the Bastille, isn't it? If not something more dramatic, given the numbers of people involved in this resistance.
There really are no words and no examples, Mary, to describe the sensation of what we're seeing here, the implications of it for China, for all countries under communist governments, and for the world are so staggering. If this, depending on how this process finally unfolds, the notion of an unarmed, peaceful uprising, creating the circumstances in which an authoritarian, autocratic, dictatorial government is forced to resign or profoundly change its policies has just absolutely staggering implications. And after many years of watching the Chinese behave in a very kind of quiet, obedient, orderly, docile, cowed manner, to see a whole people suddenly shake that off and rise up, it's a profound experience, is the only way I can describe it.
Even sitting here in Washington, reading it in the cool black and white of the New York Times print, I think Washingtonians and other Americans are almost moved to tears. We read stories, Mike, of old women throwing themselves down in the path of trucks that were trying to carry troops into the square 2 nights ago. It must be extraordinary to be there.
It is absolutely incredible, and the sense you get of ordinary people
inspired by the bravery of the students, the best and brightest in China. There was a worker the other day who was talking to a colleague and was asked, aren't you afraid for your job by coming out here to support the students? And he said, these young people, they're not afraid of dying. How can I be afraid of just losing my job? It is remarkable, and I think it shows some extraordinary qualities of the Chinese people, and I think it also shows the degree of resentment and unhappiness at what the system here has done to people over a great many years, and the deep burning desire for change and for freedom.
CNN's Mike Chenoy in Beijing, where there is officially still a news blackout. Thank you, Mike. When we come back, we will be talking to two members of